I am Kristen Murphy, the Conservation and Sustainability Planner for the town of Exeter. And I am just so thankful that you took time out of your busy days to join us in the first of 2 public sessions. So this whole effort is made possible by a coastal resilience grant from a combination of funding from NOAA as well as the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services coastal program. On a high level, what we want to do today is gather your ideas. The consultants will churn those ideas into 3 alternatives, and then we'll get your feedback a second time and select a preferred alternative from that process. And we're anticipating this project will wrap up in May 2026. So a little bit of housekeeping if you haven't been here before. The restrooms are just outside in the hallway. Many of you found the snacks in the back. Please help yourself, we have lots. And we will be recording today's presentation so that others, just the presentation portion, not the breakout groups, so that others who couldn't attend today will have an opportunity to hear the information as well. So the project team, many of who are here, include Steve Cronin, the Director of Public Works, and he's at the back. Darius Thompson, he is the representative from the trustees of Swasey Parkway. Nico Papakonstantis, he is the select board rep. Melissa Roy, the acting town manager. Myself, and then we are lucky this evening, we also have support through this grant from New Hampshire Listens. Carrie Portry is here today. She has been working with our group and other coastal resilient grantees to improve our outreach efforts, to improve our messaging and hopefully connect with a broader audience. So tonight we have Nick Messina and Phil Corbett from CMA Engineers, and you'll mostly be hearing from Nick during the presentation part, as well as Alex Patterson from EA Engineering. So with that, I'll hand it off to Nick.
Can everybody hear me okay without the microphone?
No.
No. How about now?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So we will roll with that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Messina. I'm a project manager and civil engineer with CMA Engineers, joined by Alex Patterson, my colleague from EA Engineering, and our project partners for this project. Thanks for joining us. This is the first public workshop for the Enhancing Climate Resilience in Exeter's Swasey Parkway project. Tonight we will review what we have learned about the present and future conditions about the parkway. We will walk through potential adaptation strategies, and most importantly, we want to hear your ideas, questions, and priorities for the future of the parkway. There we go. Our goals for tonight are straightforward. First, we want to introduce the project goals, why we're here, what we're looking to accomplish with this project. We're going to share some of the findings from our initial site assessment that Alex and I performed for the parkway. We will present possible adaptation strategies, and note these aren't proposed design interventions. These are merely starting points for the conversation. And finally, we want to gather community input and hear what you all have to say. There are 4 main project goals. First is to enhance the resilience of the parkway to both present flooding and future scenarios. We want to restore and enhance natural systems and promote nature-based alternatives where feasible, such as floodplain restoration or improving the vegetation throughout the parkway. We will incorporate community input into whatever conceptual designs we look to advance. And finally, we want to develop implementable projects that can be phased both for near-term adaptation as well as for long-term planning. Before we get into any of the potential adaptation strategies, I have a few disclaimers or qualifiers. So you will see several adaptation renderings tonight. None of these are proposed designs. They are to help you visualize how adaptations could be applied to parts of the parkway, but everything you see take figuratively, not literally. Again, no decisions have been made. We're not here to propose anything. Strategies can be combined, So certain adaptation strategies may be applicable in some parts of the parkway, but not every area. And finally, we will take what you have to say, and the community input will guide the next steps in the project. For an overview of the existing conditions at the parkway, there are approximately 5.5 acres of open parkland. There's a riverside trail, there's the pavilion pictured there. There's the roadway, which for the southern portion of it functions more as a walkway at this point and is not open to vehicular traffic. Looking at the shoreline, it is a mix of granite block seawall and stone revetment that does have vegetation growing through it, but that is primarily stone and cobbles there. There is mudflat habitat at the Toby slope during low tide, and then Norris Brook flows into the Swampscott River in the northern area of the parkway. So looking at the flood vulnerability under today's conditions. So pictured here is FEMA's flood map for the parkway. Now the base flood elevation is 8 feet, which does inundate nearly all of the parkway on the western bank of the Swampscott River. Pictured, we have the park completely inundated during the December 23 storm surge. On the other TV, Exeter TV has a slideshow going that has the other inundation during the January 24 storm surge, where again, the parkway was completely inundated. And another clipping from in another storm surge scenario in 2010. Now another potential vulnerability, looking at the king tide scenario. King tide is somewhat of an informal term. It refers to unusually high astronomic tides. These are independent from storm surge. They're solely based on tides and the position of the sun and the moon and the earth. And as recently as November, we had a king tide event. And you can see, based on the picture, this king tide came close to the top of the revetment and the shoreline, however, did not overtop it. You can imagine that with assuming any amount of sea level rise on top of the king tide, you would begin to see inundation. And again, the king tide happens on an annual basis. It is not the base flood elevation that we saw on the previous slide, which loosely corresponds to a 100-year storm event. The king tide is nearly an annual event. Taking the next step and moving into the future and looking at how vulnerable the parkway is to sea level rise. So currently the intermediate projections from New Hampshire DES are approximately 4 feet for the year 2100. And you'll notice on the mapping, the light blue area is the mean high water mark plus 4 feet of sea level rise, which does loosely correspond to the base flood elevation. The extents are nearly identical. So using these projections and under these assumptions, in the year 2100, the parkway would be overtopped and flooded on a daily basis in the year 2100. So what are the implications for that on habitat transformations? This mapping is from the Sea Level Affecting Marshes model, or SLAM. Now, the legend is impossibly small, you can't read it, so the important takeaways are the blue area indicates open water, the yellow indicates salt marsh habitat, and this mapping is for the year 2100, again assuming 4 feet of sea level rise. Now, this model does not take into account site-specific infrastructure, such as the seawalls and the shoreline revetments, or the dam in Norris Brook. So the important takeaway is that the site has the potential to support more high-value habitat. And in the future, as sea levels rise, salt marsh will attempt to move inland into the park area. So there are several opportunities for improvement as well as constraints that we're working against. Based on the previous slide, we saw that there are opportunities to promote or enhance the natural features of the park, convert habitat in some areas from maybe grassy open areas to more high-value habitat. And there are also opportunities to enhance the shoreline, because once the seawall is overtopped on a daily basis, it somewhat loses its function anyways. As far as challenges, number one, we want to balance ecology ecology with existing uses of the park. The park hosts many events. People are used to using it for a variety of recreational uses. And so we need to balance whatever changes are forthcoming or proposed with the comfort level in adjusting to those potential park uses. The existing infrastructure is also a challenge. Like I said, once the seawall is overtopped on a daily basis, it's not functional anyways. However, it's a significant undertaking to execute some of these infrastructure improvements. And during the site assessment, we also noted the presence of invasive species in certain areas. The potential adaptation strategies can be broken down into 3 broad categories. There's resist, where we try and keep the water from coming into our project area. There's accommodate, where we learn to live with the water coming in with maybe minor realignment. And then there's retreat, where we move structures out of the way, or we accept the conversion of land uses and allow the water to colonize the project area. So the first adaptation strategy that I will walk through is resist and what that can look like applied to Swasey Parkway. The obvious resist strategy is to elevate key structures or shoreline infrastructure. So the table summarizes some key elevations. The riverside walkway is typically around 5.5 to 6 feet in elevation. The roadway of Swasey Parkway is slightly higher than that. The current high water mark is 3.6, and when you add the sea level rise projection onto that, you get a 2100 mean high water mark of around 7.2. So that's where we see it starts to overtop the riverside walkways and Swasey Park roadway under the scenario. And then once you add add sea level rise to the base flood elevation, we start to see some serious inundation of the parkway and even further upland. So, how can we resist this? We can raise the riverside walkway, we can raise the roadway if maintaining access to that is critical, and it can double as a berm to protect the inland areas. You could construct a better, higher seawall along the shoreline, and in effect see no changes on the interior of the parkway. So again, these are visual renderings that please take conceptually, not literally. The chain link fence in all likelihood would need to go back. We can't have children falling into the river, but for artistic purposes, it is omitted. So the adaptation figures, you're looking at the elevated riverside walkway adjacent to a seawall, so adding elevation adjacent to the river and protecting the inland zones. The bottom figure is, again, you're looking at a seawall kind of stacked on top of the revetment area on the Swampscott shoreline. Looking at the strategy in other locations, so the top is the roadway itself, raised with pretty modest grassy side slopes coming down the existing area, so you can see that it's minimally impactful to the rest of the park if you focus on elevating one structure as a protection mechanism. Now, since this roadway doesn't actually function as a roadway at this point in time, if you're reconstructing it anyways, is there an opportunity to convert it into a multi-use path with bike lanes and pedestrian lanes instead of an actual roadway? And then the bottom figure is a seawall, again, along the shoreline of the river adjacent to that riverside walkway. How can we help the utilities in the area resist flooding? So there's a pump station that is what that white vinyl fence surrounds. Now the first floor elevation of that pump station is largely safe. However, the ground around it is inundated under those base flood scenarios, making it inaccessible during flooding. So do we need to raise the ground around that? Do we need to, again, construct some sort of berm that protects the integrity of the pump station? There's also a significant amount of drainage within the parkway. The road has many catch basins and pipes that serve only the roadway and no broader drainage network. So again, if it's not a roadway, is some of that infrastructure redundant? Is there an opportunity to eliminate or consolidate some of the drainage structures so that they do not become flow paths to the floodwaters coming back through the pipes, surcharging the catch basins and then flooding the roadway. However, there are several drainage networks from upland that in residential areas that do discharge into the river. We obviously can't abandon those, so we need to look at retrofitting those with tile flap gates that can prevent water from migrating up into the drainage networks. However, it's likely the systems would need increased storage in some capacity because of these systems. If you get a freshwater event when the tide is high and the water is nowhere to discharge, it ends up just flooding the upland areas. For the suite of accommodate strategies, I will turn it over to my colleague, Alex.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So my name is Alex Patterson. I'm a senior ecologist at EA Engineering. And as Nick mentioned, I'm going to walk through sort of the second of the three kind of major categories of adaptation strategies, which is accommodate. And so as this slide illustrates, the accommodate kind of category of adaptation strategies is really about trying to maintain the existing uses of the area as much as possible, while also acknowledging the fact that sea level rise is happening and will accelerate into the future. And so rather than trying to necessarily keep the water out of the area, the kind of accommodate approach seeks to sort of allow the sort of natural processes to happen while also maintaining the uses of the site. So these are going to be primarily a suite of what you could think of as kind of softer or greener approaches, less focused on kind of infrastructure improvements and changes and more on habitat and vegetation management. So the first one of those is a vegetation management plan. And this is a pretty low cost, relatively low effort type of strategy compared to some of the more significant infrastructure changes that is basically geared towards just providing a more salt-tolerant vegetation community within the park that's more adaptable to the way that conditions are likely to be in the future. So basically what this entails is kind of developing a long-term plan for how vegetation within the park would be managed with the goal of kind of transitioning the less salt-tolerant plantings to plants that are more capable of thriving in an environment that receives occasional inundation or salt spray or other forms of kind of saltwater interaction. And so related to that is the next one, which is the invasive species management plan. So currently there are a number of invasive plant species located within the park, including Phragmites, purple loosestrife, other upland species. And so these are in this photo around Norris Brook, as well as in other upland areas of the park. And kind of this sort of goes hand in hand with the previous slide in the sense that managing invasive species is kind of a key way to help facilitate the migration of coastal habitats into new areas as sea level rises. So with other changes that may be happening to sort of improve the resilience of the park, there's opportunities for managing invasive species to improve habitat and improve aesthetics. And so staying on Norris Brook, there's some additional adaptation strategies here that can help sort of accommodate sea level rise and the expected increases in coastal flooding, while also improving habitat and sort of maintaining the existing uses of the park. And one of these is the removal of this small dam on the brook. It's very small. It's only maybe a foot or two high above the bed of the creek. But it does sort of block fish passage and aquatic life movement. It really doesn't provide any flood protection. It really doesn't serve any sort of practical purpose. And so that's a potential adaptation strategy to remove that and help convert Norris Brook into a more tidally influenced creek, which again sort of goes in hand with the vegetation management. And so these renderings kind of show what that looks like. So on the left-hand side are an existing aerial and an at-grade photo of Norris Brook, and then on the right, basically just showing some visualizations that depict what the brook could look like if the dam were removed and invasive vegetation along the banks of the stream were managed in order to encourage more salt-tolerant lands. And so continuing in the sort of accommodate category of strategies, so this slide kind of depicts this continuum of different living shoreline approaches, where on the far left you have sort of the softest green techniques, which is basically just a purely vegetated shoreline with no kind of armoring of any kind, and then on the far right, kind of just a vertical bulkhead, so sort of the most infrastructure intensive option. And so as Nick mentioned, most of the shoreline along the park now is kind of a combination of revetment and seawall. So you can see that's sort of on the grayer side of this continuum. And so an option for accommodating sea level rise that could be done in conjunction with some of the other infrastructure management approaches that maintain existing uses is placing or adapting the existing shoreline structure to be more of a vegetated sill or a combination of sill and revetment. And again, this is primarily related to improving habitat value, attenuating wave action, and providing flood storage. And so this rendering also depicts sort of what that would look like. So on the left is an existing photograph of the revetment along the shoreline of the park. And then on the right is an example of a strategy where the revetment is replaced with more of a softer vegetated shoreline with a more gradual transition down into the river, likely with some rock toe protection that is still incorporated in that. And then to wrap it up, I will hand it back to Nick to talk about the retreat options.
All right, thank you, Alex. So our final broad adaptation strategy that we're going to look at is retreat, which again is allowing the water to enter and accepting the implications of that. So what does retreat look like? It may look like a floodable park, where you redesign low areas to become wetlands, accept the periodic storage and the flood attenuation that comes with that. This would accept the marsh migration into the upland areas, maybe replacing some of the areas that are currently just grassy lawn. And again, this one, more than any of the other strategies, are extremely long-term planning horizon. This is nothing that we would look to build today. This is looking forward to 2100, when that seawall again is projected to be overtopped on a daily basis anyways. So can we reimagine the park as a floodable park with recreational opportunities throughout and more salt marsh wetland areas? The image you see is a concept of a project in Prague on the shores of this river. This light industrial use, continuously flooded. They are opting to buy out the industrial properties and replace it with this floodable area to restore the floodplain and add recreational amenities. Looking at a real-world example that has been constructed, the Hunters Point Park in Queens, New York is kind of the foremost case study in a floodable park. It is right on the banks of the ocean, and it has stormwater wetlands and rain gardens throughout, areas that are designed to accept floodwaters and store them, and what looks like the world's most expensive pedestrian walkway. So again, adding recreational amenities in addition to those green storage options. And so on the right is a loose rendering of what this could look like applied to Swasey Parkway, where again, that large grassy area or maybe parts of it can get converted to more salt marsh or storage wetland areas, and you still have walking trails throughout. As far as next steps, we want to engage you all tonight and gather your input on these potential adaptation strategies. We will take your input and develop a few conceptual designs that are a little more thought out than the renderings you saw. And we will come back in a couple months with a second public workshop to present these real renderings. So the next portion of tonight is a more interactive breakout group that some of the project partners and I will be facilitating. Before we get into the breakout sessions, we did want to do a quicker version of a Q&A for clarifying questions. At the conclusion of the breakout session, we'll reconvene and do a full public comment and Q&A. But if there are any clarifying questions about the adaptation strategies, I think it's important we address those first. I saw your hand go up first.
This is a little bit outside the bailiwick of this project, but it's critical.
It's okay, so is a floatable park.
I would like to know what the town can do for best management practices to treat our stormwater better. We have lots of non-permeable surfaces, and I don't know your data, how much of the flooding is due to runoff or sea level rise. Maybe you could provide that information at some point.
Yeah, certainly.
But there are lots of things we can do. I mean, we can have, I won't elaborate much more. We can require all new building to have retention on site. Stormwater retention on site. Lots of jurisdictions do it based on a 200-year floodplain. But we can require permeable surfaces with good structure underneath to handle stormwater. I'm talking about elsewhere in town. So I just throw that out there because it's a little wider than your net, but I think it's germane to the problem.
I agree. And looking at Swasey Parkway specifically, I did mention there were a couple of stormwater discharge pipes that do discharge through the parkway. So under the utility improvements strategy, looking to expand subsurface storage and treatment options when the system will be inundated in the present and more so in the future. And then like the floodplain enhancement, that all goes into improving stormwater quality as well, and creating salt marsh habitat sort of acts as a sponge and attenuates a lot of that storm surge as well. But to your first question, the flooding and the base flood elevation and the FEMA flooding?
Right, the sea level rise and then storm event runoff.
Correct. So under the
sources.
Under FEMA scenario, flooding is primarily derived from storm surge. That's the Swampscott backing up and flooding the parkway. But certainly in the future, even when it's not a Q100 storm surge, if those pipes are inundated at their outfall, the stormwater is just going to have nowhere to go, and so the upland, it will exacerbate flooding in the upland areas as well.
Thanks.
All right, 3 things. So in the last part, you mentioned buying up properties, or getting the properties, industrial properties or something like that. What happens to the old folks' home there at 277 Water Street?
Yes, so maybe that was a dangerous example. In the Prague project, they bought up light industrial. That is certainly not on the table for anything we're discussing here today. We are only looking at Swasey Parkway and none of the adjacent residential properties. So everything we're looking to do in this project is confined to the parkway, and buying up those properties is certainly not on the table.
Okay, so in the first option, where the parkway is raised, not raised, raised, elevated, raised. It's good that you're going to keep the chain link fence. The question is, what happens to the trees that are there? What happens to the park benches? Because the park benches have their memorial benches, so they should be preserved one way or another, replanted in different places. But the view, everybody goes down there for the view. So having a wall that sits up like this, you can't see it. Half the people walking along won't be able to see it. But if the wall is like this, and the chain link fence is like that, just like it is now, we're going to have better luck. The old people like to have their view,
Yeah. No, that's a good comment, and if we develop that design, if we take that into the conceptual design, that's definitely something to look at. What are the impacts to the benches and the trees and views? Sure.
What are the town's access needs in terms of the existing utilities there? Will they need a roadway to access those, or are there alternate ways of accessing those?
As far as like the sewer and the drainage that are under the parkway?
Sure.
Yeah, so the town will certainly need access to all those features in the event of a break or for routine maintenance. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a paved roadway to access it. It could be a dirt road if that's something we were looking at exploring.
Thank you.
I just have a process question.
Sure.
So I understand none of this is even a proposed design at this point.
Sure.
The end of this, like the public comment and then the ensuing meetings, is there a sort of time horizon for what would then be recommended to the town?
Yeah, so this project in its current phase is only scoped to go through conceptual design.
Okay.
So we'll come back with 3 more refined ones. And the end goal was to come up with one singular proposed design, but that may not even be appropriate. I mean, several of these may be appropriate to keep in mind on a short-term basis and a long-term basis. So right now, as far as timeline, this phase will wrap up by spring.
But I guess what I'm asking is like, okay, at the end, okay, so in spring, then something is then taken to the town. Are we contemplating then something that gets voted on? Maybe this is a question for a town person, but it gets voted on the following spring, and then it's a whatever, like a 5-year construction plan, or like what's the output for the town?
At the risk of speaking for the town, I'll give it to Chris.
Well, I'm nervous to speak for the town too. So I guess I would say that this will give us a conceptual design that we then have a ballpark of, what we're looking at for a concept. Any development, major development in town has to go through our capital improvement process. And so that's a, multi-year planning process, and that will include budget planning. But there may be components of this that we can do in the near term. So I don't think there's one answer to that, but I think from the product from this, the goal is to help that fuel and inform future funding requests down the road.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Just one other, it's not really a question, just your comments were approaching this as though none of the roadway is for vehicles, and that's not the case. Half of the parkway is open to vehicles, and I was confused by your presentation as though no vehicles are allowed there. It was a big deal. The people who work for the town as select board know that, and so I don't know if that's factored.
It was subtle, Leslie, but he did say the southern part of the roadway is closed.
Thank you for
Okay,
picking
It was
up on the
very
subtlety.
quick. It was very quick, you flipped through it.
Yes, I am
Okay.
aware, I follow Seacoast Online, I understand that was a tough process, and we don't need to dive too deeply into
No,
that.
we
But
don't.
the northern part of the roadway is vehicular, supports parking, has the turnaround. It's the
Yeah,
southern
okay.
area that's currently not a roadway, functioning in
Correct.
its current capacity.
So, the Norris Brook part of it, though, is in the vehicular part.
That's correct.
So I don't know if that impacts any of that. I just needed that clarification, thank you.
Sure.
Just, if I could tailor it, most of the flooding happens on the southern end.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
for now.
Sure.
Question somewhat related is, this park's overseen by the trustees, and there's a deed, and it's complicated, and we've had lots of town decisions. Do the trustees have certain restrictions on what they could actually, the town have restrictions on what they would implement, or do we not want to think about that right now? And that'll come down the road, but, is there a framework for limiting like crazy ideas here that wouldn't be actually implementable because of how the park is set up currently?
The governance.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely a question worth asking now, because we don't want to go down the road and then 6 months later we're like, we took a wrong turn, we can't do this anyways. The trustees are a very active participant in the project. Darius looks like he couldn't be with us tonight, but he has been part of every meeting, and this is a very collaborative effort between the town and the trustees. So we're trying to get everybody on the same page, so we push forward a design that's acceptable to all parties. do one more?
Yes. Sort of getting back to what an earlier speaker said about, you know, a little bit outside of what you're talking about, but what's happening across the river with Clemson Pond? Has anybody talked about pulling that out and bringing back the salt marsh? And I mean, it's not gonna cure Swasey's problem, but it might buy a little time. You know, as the tide comes up, it'll have that many more acres, acre feet of area to go into instead of going up into the, you know, up into the tidal area and then just continuing to rise.
Looks like Steve wants to comment.
So as of right now, we're required to have Clemson Pond. It's where we discharge our combined sewer overflow. The town does have a CSO long-term control plan, so in an ideal world, as we head down the road here, we're going to be addressing a lot of those connections between the wastewater system and the stormwater system to hopefully eliminate those. I don't have a time frame for when that will happen, but the hope would be in the future, we address all those, and then Clemson Pond is allowed to be used for something other than its current use as a CSO. So there may be an option for that at some point, but for the purposes of this project, we're at least assuming that it's going to be in place until those are all taken care of.
Great, thanks.
We can certainly do more questions and comments at the end, but I think now we want to launch into our breakout sessions and make things a little more interactive. So if we can loosely try and break up into thirds, the idea is that each of the table has aerial printouts of the parkway. So we have a retreat map and accommodate map and a resist map, and we want to facilitate discussions. The project partners will be there. We want to get feedback on where the public thinks some of these strategies are applicable in certain parts of the park. So if we all rise and loosely divide ourselves in thirds.
So we're kind of thinking about 10 minutes.